As well as being a huge N64 fan, I also love the world of music, and the 1980s was an era full of some awesome innovation and some truly incredible tracks. If there's one thing I think of around the music genre, it's so many one-hit wonders lighting up the charts. You know, the artist who'd release an absolute masterpiece of a track, but when you listen to the rest of the album you start wondering what the hell happened. This led me to think about the Nintendo 64 and how, despite my love of it, just how many incredible one-hit wonders there were on the system. There are many unsurpassed entries into gaming series with a long history, but what about those titles which were pretty much one and done, and have never seen a comeback since? Some of these games deserved sequels, and for various reasons they've never materialised even to this day. Some of these games were sleeper hits on their release, and others were smash hits, but here we are decades later waiting for a true sequel. And so for today's video, we're taking a look at the N64's one-hit wonders. And as always, if you're wanting a more in-depth or detailed review of any of the titles in this video, then check out the description box where I'll link you to the individual reviews for the games mentioned. I've mentioned before that one thing I loved about the N64 era was that it felt like game studios were really open to trying some weird and wonderful ideas. These days some of the concepts would never even make it past the drawing room, and yet here we have a game that on paper is so bizarre you'd wonder who in their right mind would ever greenlight it. Developed by DMA Design and published by Take-Two Interactive in 1998, Space Station Silicon Valley sees you take control of a robotic microchip which has crash-landed in this awesome platform puzzle game hybrid. By taking control of a microchip, you have the ability to enter unusual animals across the game's levels, and you must work out how to combine each animal's unique abilities to reach the level's objective. The game contains a completely wacky concept, but it just works so well. With a massive range of animals to possess, and combining clever puzzle elements with some tight platforming, the game is really unlike anything else on the system. Throw in some cool completionist elements like each level having a secret special objective, and there's a massive amount of replayability here for anyone who really gets drawn into the game. The game did receive positive reviews as a whole in its release, with most magazines noting the unique nature of the game, really offering the game as something unlike anything else that they'd experienced before. IGN actually noted that the game is near flawless, and it also earned Editor's Choice Awards across many publications. So with the press praising the game and being really a unique title, why haven't we seen a follow-up? Well, firstly, the game didn't sell anywhere near as well as another game which DMA started production on at the same time as Space Station Silicon Valley. You may have heard of an obscure little title called Grand Theft Auto. What perhaps people didn't see was that a later port of this game was released for the PlayStation called Evo Space Adventures, which many consider to be one of the laziest and poorest ports ever made. It was a port riddled with bugs and performance issues, and ultimately got panned by the press, which all but killed off all of the underground buzz the game had generated on Nintendo 64. So with Grand Theft Auto having stolen the limelight, and really went on to become an absolute monster hit, and as well as sales of Space Station Silicon Valley being below expectations, it's fair to say that there was little interest internally for a sequel to ever be made when it was clear that GTA was the company's hottest property. In hindsight, this was a fantastic piece of business, but that doesn't detract from the fact that I would absolutely love to see a follow-up to this title, using a modern game engine as well as level design to make it another outright classic in my opinion. Speaking of Grand Theft Auto killing off a sequel, what about one of my personal favourites and a game which I know N64 Today absolutely loves too? For those who haven't checked out N64 Today, head on over to the website because it's honestly one of the most entertaining N64 related websites around. But back to this video, and Body Harvest is a game which I really struggled to go into really too much depth about, because the internal problems regarding its production really are best suited to the lengthy video review I published about the game, so you can hear all about Nintendo's interference, the game being dropped, and many of the internal disagreements between the publisher and the developer during the game's lengthy production. But for this summary video, it is a game which very nearly didn't exist, but somehow scraped it through production hell to give gamers an early taste of what a 3D Grand Theft Auto would be like. Now, I'm not a big fan of the modern 3D Grand Theft Auto games, and I do much prefer the old school early releases. but if I had to summarise Body Harvest quickly for someone who doesn't know about it, then I'd say it's almost like playing a Starship Troopers version if there was a Grand Theft Auto 2.5. You assume the role of Adam Drake, who's a genetically engineered soldier who must travel through different time periods to different parts of the world to combat an alien invasion who are here with the intent of harvesting human bodies, hence the game's title Body Harvest. What makes this game so special is the ability to explore the vast terrain with little restrictions in terms of where you go. There are villages for you to explore, buildings to search, people to interact with, and if you come across a vehicle, you're able to enter it and take control, whether that be cars, aeroplanes, boats or so on. As you blast your way through wave upon wave of alien scum, you have a range of weapons and the occasional puzzle to solve, but as a whole the game is a nice blend of action, exploration, with some minor RPG-like elements. Because the scope of the game was so ahead of its time, you would need to have some patience with this one. It's not as well balanced as something like Grand Theft Auto 3, but when playing the game you can almost see many elements which were perhaps here for testing before being fully fleshed out in a later edition. The game received slightly above average reviews on its release, and the biggest problem that many reviewers of the time had was that although it's a clever title, it didn't seem quite as polished and fully fleshed out to make it a must-buy title. I also think that at times the objectives can be hard to understand, and with some huge timescales between save points, it can at times be very frustrating to play. So it's probably clear why we didn't get a sequel for this title, but the game continues to have a cult following, and perhaps one day the developer will look deep into their archives of some franchises they want to reinvent, and this one may happen. Now I'd be very doubtful of this ever happening, but with modern game engines and all of their experience now of creating masterpieces when it comes to open world gameplay, this would be a surefire hit in my opinion. If you've been around here long enough, you'll know just how much praise I lash down on Beetle Adventure Racing. Simply put, it's one of the console's funnest racing games and one which I think everyone simply must have in their collection. Picking, you guessed it, a Volkswagen Beetle, you're then presented with tracks to race on which contain the absolute perfect mix of exploration, incredible track design, and a gameplay system involving points and racing which pushes the player to try and use the scenery in imaginative ways to really fully master each track. The funniest thing about Beetle Adventure Racing is that before its release, practically nobody knew much about it. I remember one magazine, maybe N64 magazine, who published their review of the game and called it the best surprise release they'd ever come across. There was no months of build-up, no constant delays with the release date, and very little press coverage before it actually arrived as a completed game. The game was released and it was a statement saying, here's our racing game and we think it's damn awesome, and it was. The game engine seems perfectly balanced for the game as the graphics are brilliant for the console and everything runs just so smoothly, aside from some very infrequent bits of slowdown in some of the more spectacular set pieces in some levels. There's also a 4-player mode which is actually quite fun to play, and there's a ton of replayability in the single player mode as you try to get the max score on each possible track. With extra cars to unlock, including a police beetle which has a working siren that slows down other drivers, and there's a huge amount of attention to detail that went into making this title enjoyable to play. So how come we never got a sequel for this one? Well, in Australia the game went under a different branding, and the game was released around the time of the redesign and reintroduction of the classic Beetle from Volkswagen. Although the game's not exactly a promotional release in many ways, it sometimes actually kind of does feel like that. So without much reason to make a sequel, as the redesign of the Beetle was done at that time, the studio went on to other projects and have never revisited this concept. Blastcore is a game which would always be featured on television coverage of Nintendo 64, and I must admit when I first saw the sight of a giant mech levelling a skyscraper, I instantly knew it was a game that I would love. With the expected rare magic thrown in this unique Destructum-up, it's really not like anything else I've come across, and perhaps only Rampage could be considered in the same genre as this. The aim of the game is really simple. You've got to clear the path for an out of control nuclear bomb passing through the level. The range of vehicles to use changes throughout the game, and some are simply a way for you to smash as much as possible that you can see, and other levels involve a clever use of machinery to almost throw in a puzzle-like element to the game. With medals awarded for each level completion, there's an insane amount of replayability. and some of the comment sections of the actual review I did of the game, you'll see that getting every single level 100% completed is something that even Gerard would struggle with. It's an easy game to pick up and play, but a hard game to master, and one which I think everyone should be checking out. I think this one's quite easy to see why we didn't get a sequel. With Rare having two teams working internally on different titles at all times, they were known as a company for their innovation in creating new IPs and game styles. They really could throw their hands at anything and turn it into a hit. Now, in all honesty, I could throw a range of other Rare titles from the console, such as Jet Force Gemini, Diddy Kong Racing and GoldenEye to this list, with the reasoning is usually universally accepted that Rare simply preferred to create new games, and so when they did make a sequel such as Banjo-Tooie, it was usually because they felt they could add something more that they previously weren't able to for whatever reason that may be. Now, I do doubt we'll ever see a sequel to Blastcore, but at least it stands as one of the console's most instantly recognisable titles and one which is damn fun to play. Among Konami's many releases on Nintendo 64, one which often goes under the radar is Hybrid Heaven, a weird sci-fi RPG game which admittedly you'll either love or hate. The storyline is a typical Kojima wackiness which involves aliens, the president, body-snatching clone beings. Throw in some aliens, pro wrestling combat, and some scenes stolen directly from movies, and you have Hybrid Heaven in a nutshell. The Nintendo 64 was notoriously slim when it came to RPG titles, and so for any console owners who were craving this genre, you'd likely have picked up this game, but with mixed reviews and a storyline which at times can be far too convoluted for its own good, and you should easily be able to see why this game didn't exactly set new sales records on its release. Saying that though, some gamers, myself included, found this to be a wonderfully strange game to play. Arriving at the peak of the Attitude Era in the WWF, the game's fighting moves, instead of the usual RPG swords or guns, makes this game something refreshing to play. Konami Osaka wanted this game to be the answer to Konami Japan's Metal Gear Solid, and although it's quite clear it doesn't even come close to the PS1 masterpiece, I do still think this is worth checking out. The two-player mode is definitely a pass from me, but as a single-player story mode experience, then it's one of the better RPGs on the console, even though that isn't really saying too much. So will we ever get a sequel for this title? Simply put, the answer's no. With a 99.9% confidence rating, I think it's fair to say that the mixed reception and poor sales mean that Konami are in no hurry to revisit this aged IP. On top of that, Konami hates gamers, they hate your money, and they hate everything to do with games, it seems. Take a poorly represented genre on Nintendo 64, throw in some Mortal Kombat style violence, and set it back in a historical setting. MACE The Dark Age, developed and published by Atari in arcades in 1997, and later arriving on Nintendo 64, is one of the most enjoyable fighters on the system. The cast of fighters takes you across the globe to historical rip-offs of many famous figures, so expect to play as characters like executioners, samurais, warlords and knights. I first borrowed the game from a friend of mine after not being that excited to pick it up myself, but after playing it for a short while I began to love the bloody mess that this game presents. The game centres around a 12th century plot by a covenant of warriors called the Seven, who have agreed to kill a dark arts warlord called Asmodeus. Now, nobody plays Mortal Kombat for the storyline, and let's be honest, nobody would be willing to play this game for its storyline either, but it's hard not to recommend this title to anyone who likes 3D fighters with a dose of ultra-violence. The weapon-heavy combat system is really fun to play, and each character legitimately feels unique and takes time to really learn and master how best to play as them. The soundtrack thumps along with bass-heavy riffs, and the sound effects are brutally rough and ready. What most people remember the game for are the executions, which are essentially the game's fatalities, which are as creative as they are macabre. So why no sequel to this one? Well, this is one game that there doesn't really seem to be any definitive answer for. In my opinion, any number of modern studios could pick up the rights, and although the brand value of the title wouldn't really add anything of value, then I think it would act as a really good starting block to build a medieval style fighting game with the modern hardware. It could and perhaps almost certainly should look absolutely epic. Rounding off our list for today comes Mischief Makers, perhaps one of the most requested games on this list for a sequel, and one which many gamers have been demanding ever since the game was first released in 1997. Developed by Treasure, that's pretty much all you should need to know to realise that this game would be something unique and fabulous. A 2D side-scrolling platform game released with sprites which were out of fashion on a console, which was always trying to push everything into 3D. The game has a cult following from gamers who fell in love with the weird mechanics, odd little game world, and Marina, who is one of the coolest female lead characters in any video game. As the studio's debut console game for Nintendo 64, they actually began development way back in 1995, and without knowing much about the console's hardware capabilities, they were advised it would allow much improved pixel quality, and so they set about working on a game with that in mind, perhaps not expecting the 3D power would actually be satisfactory. Perhaps that's a good thing, because with so few 2D sprite-based games on the console, it helps this really stand out, despite some reviewers naturally saying the game would have been better suited in 3D when it was reviewed, way back in the day. With some puzzle elements thrown in, some unbelievable boss battles that literally fill the screen with beautiful sprites, this is one game which everyone should at least be checking out. Now I say that with a caveat, because as much as this game seems to be universally praised, I've still come across some people who really don't get on with it, and they find the notorious shake gameplay mechanic to be too awkward and really too hard to get to grips with. So will we ever get a sequel to this one? Well, for some reason I remain slightly optimistic that one day it may happen, but I think it's one of those games which would need a sustained community push directly to a studio to get them to pay attention, and to realise that there's money to be made by reprising this classic from the 64-bit era. So those are my picks for the Nintendo 64's one-hit wonders, and so I'd love for you to comment down below any other games which were one and done, so that everyone else can read these comments and find perhaps their next sleeper hit for them to play. I'd also love to know your personal reasons why you think any of the titles mentioned in this video either haven't been graced with another entry into the series, or if you think any of the games are best left alone and stuck in the past as a piece of gaming nostalgia rather than a cash cow for a studio to try a modern interpretation of it. As always, sound off in the comments section down below, and until next time.